a strategy must exist. If you know what you want to achieve in the long term, then strategy is the plan for how to get there.
Who should initiate and drive the request for developing a strategy?
Consultants cannot create a strategy for you.
There's a view among business leaders that strategic planning no longer makes sense.
One needs to dive into the details.
Is SWOT analysis outdated? Does it aid strategy or should it be discarded as a template?
We absolutely must begin to generate new strategic initiatives.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. As you know, members of boards of directors, advisory boards, and supervisory boards constantly operate at the strategic level. Accordingly, from time to time, they participate in strategy development, either as members of the strategic planning group, as facilitators, or even as methodological advisors in the strategy process. That is why Armen Kurginian, Dimitro Kozlov, and I decided to release a series of episodes dedicated to different approaches to strategy development. Today, we have Andriy Zurban as our guest. Andriy is a senior business trainer and consultant at the company Develer Ukraine.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Greetings to everyone.
Recently, we've heard many provocative statements about strategy. For example, that strategic sessions are harmful and do not actually help in developing a strategy. That is one perspective. Many owners, however, believe that a strategic session is the strategy process itself. In other words, the strategy is developed during the strategic session, and after that, it can simply be implemented. From that point on, the strategy development stage is considered complete. What do you think about this, Andriy? What is your perspective?
My view is somewhat complex, let's put it that way. First of all, many people indeed believe that strategy no longer works, and that strategy development itself is pointless, especially when external conditions are changing so rapidly and so dramatically. But I disagree with that. A strategy must exist. Recently, I watched a video by Martin Reeves, who works at the senior level at Boston Consulting Group. He says that today we actually need a strategy for strategy itself, because the concept has become somewhat discredited, and people often feel confused about what strategy really is and how it should be developed. At the same time, I do not agree with the idea that strategy is created during strategic sessions. Strategic planning and strategy development are complex and, frankly, long-term processes. Strategic sessions certainly play a role in them, but they do not define or replace the entire process. That is why it is important to dive into the details.
From time to time, people ask why strategy is even necessary today, given that we live in what is often called a VUCA world. The situation is extremely complicated. There's a war, everything is unpredictable. That's true, and it's genuinely tragic. But even in such circumstances, strategy is still necessary. At the very least, it increases the probability of achieving your strategic goals. Probably yes. What do you think?
Absolutely. During my trainings, I often recall a story from the book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, written more than 150 years ago. When Alice first meets the Cheshire Cat, she asks him, "Could you please tell me which way I should go?" And he replies, "That depends a good deal on where you want to get to." She answers, "I don't much care where." And he says, "Then it doesn't much matter which way you go. You'll get somewhere anyway. The only important thing is not to stop walking." So if people truly do not care where they want to end up, then perhaps strategy is unnecessary. But if you know what you want to achieve in the long term, then strategy is simply your plan for how to get there.
There are many definitions of strategy, dozens of them in fact, and each expert interprets it somewhat differently. At one point, Sergiy and I described strategy as a comprehensive plan of action. Briefly put, one aimed at achieving a strategic goal.
Then we started arguing.
We began debating whether that definition is actually accurate. So how would you define it? What is strategy really?
Let me put it this way. As often happens in life, there is no single perfectly correct definition. Let's look at it from several perspectives. First of all, the word strategy originated in ancient Greece several thousand years ago, where it originally meant the art of a military commander. Today, a common general definition is that strategy is a broad, not overly detailed plan of activity designed for the long term. Right? But we also have the well-known gurus of strategy. If you open almost any textbook, you will inevitably find references to Michael Porter and Henry Mintzberg. Michael Porter says that in a business context, strategy is a deliberate choice of actions that must be different from those of your competitors. These actions are aimed at creating and sustaining unique value for your business. So we can say that strategy is about having a goal and understanding what your competitors are doing. If we turn to Henry Mintzberg, he argues that strategy is actually a very complex concept. He even proposed a model known as the 5 Ps for strategy. In this model, strategy is certainly about plans. That is the first P. P as in plans, right? But strategy is not only about plans. It also includes ploys, tactical maneuvers, or actions you might use, for example, to confuse or outmaneuver competitors. It also involves patterns, consistent behaviors, or ways of operating within your organization. Strategy also relates to position, understanding where you are now and where you want to be in the future. And the fifth P refers to perspective. In other words, you need to look at things from multiple angles in order to build a truly comprehensive picture. Only then can you truly be effective in your business. So this is actually a very complex question.
Andrew, there is one provocative question. With our previous guests, we have encountered very different opinions about SWOT analysis. Is SWOT outdated? Does it still help in strategy development? Or should it be discarded as a template that oversimplifies things and fails to provide the broader perspective on strategy that you mentioned?
My personal view is that SWOT is a very important tool. The problem is that many people who conduct a SWOT analysis do not actually understand the purpose of this instrument. They do not understand at what stage of the strategic planning process it should be used or how it should be done properly. Let me explain this briefly. A very common mistake is that people start the strategy process with SWOT, but that is not the beginning. It should appear somewhere in the middle of the process, because in order to perform a high-quality SWOT analysis, you first need to analyze the business environment. You also need to review your own actions in the past. You should analyze the broader business environment, including economic, political, social, cultural, and other factors. You need to look at your competitors, what they are doing, and how they are doing it, and conduct a competitive landscape analysis. You should also think about benchmarking. Who can we learn from and why? Only after that should we conduct a SWOT analysis. That is the first point. The second point is another common mistake. People often mix up many different things within SWOT. This is especially true for the opportunities and threats parts of the analysis. Many people assume that opportunities are things we are capable of doing, but that is not correct. The opportunities and threats section should focus strictly on external factors. In other words, an opportunity is not something we can do. It is something that exists in the external environment that we can potentially leverage. This distinction is extremely important, yet people misunderstand it very often.
Provoking the discussion about SWOT analysis. Just to challenge the idea a bit further, yes, you're absolutely right. We conduct an environmental analysis, analyze the competitive landscape, review how we operate, look at opportunities, and eventually we put all of that into a table.
Well, not everything.
All right, not everything, fair enough. But then what? We've done it. Usually the table is presented somewhere in a presentation, and that's it. After that, people move on to discussing strategic initiatives. So, essentially, I think those who say SWOT is not that important are coming from the fact that afterward, it is rarely used as an actual tool beyond that summary table.
In other words, why do we need it at all?
Yes.
By the way, I would add that, in my opinion, the process of creating it may actually be more important than the final result. So the key question is not so much why we need the final table, but rather what we did in order to get there, because that involves analysis, discussion, studying the environment, and so on. My apologies.
All right, colleagues. Let's take a look at it this way. Earlier, I mentioned that SWOT is neither the beginning nor the end. It sits somewhere in the middle of the process. And a very important question is what we actually do with that SWOT afterward. The answer is that based on the SWOT analysis, the business should start generating strategic initiatives. So what exactly are strategic initiatives? These are specific actions which, as Michael Porter tells us, should differ from the actions of competitors. And these actions should pursue two main objectives. First, to make the best and fullest possible use of the opportunities we see in the external environment, relying on our own strengths. Second, these initiatives should help prevent or mitigate the risks we identify in the external environment. They may also aim to offset or reduce the weaknesses we see within our own organization. And this again brings us back to the issue of quality. As the English say, and I'll provoke you a little here, there is a principle. Garbage in, garbage out. If the input is poor, the output will be poor as well. So if we conduct a low-quality analysis of the environment, we will end up with a low-quality SWOT analysis. And if the SWOT analysis is poor, we will not be able to generate strong strategic initiatives.
If SWOT, or S4, can be useful, what other methodologies can help us prepare properly for strategy development?
Or tools.
Or tools?
Let's try to outline in general terms what the process of strategic planning or strategy development looks like. First, an important disclaimer. You cannot immediately create a detailed strategy. Initially, you have to work at what the English call the top line. What does that mean? It means answering three very important questions. The first is, where do we want to play? The second is, why exactly there? And the third is, how can we win there? There are separate methodologies designed to answer each of these questions. For example, there is a classic tool. To determine where to play, there is the well-known model called the Ansoff matrix, where we compare the market we want to compete in with the product we offer. The model includes 4 combinations: existing market or new market, and existing product or new product. These combinations ultimately produce 4 possible strategic directions or types of strategies. It is very important to determine this because, for example, if you want to compete in an existing market with an existing product, that is the safest type of strategy. You already know the market, you know your product, and you can rely on your strengths while taking advantage of the opportunities the market offers. On the other hand, if you launch a completely new product in a completely new market, that is the most risky strategy. It requires a very clear understanding of many factors, and a lot can go wrong along the way. So that is the first point. Next, to determine why you want to compete in a particular market, there is a model known as TAM-SAM-SOM market sizing model. It helps you assess the size of the market and, so to speak, the share of the pie that you could realistically capture. In other words, is the opportunity attractive enough or not? There are different ways to estimate the size of the market you want to enter. And to determine how you intend to compete and win against your rivals, there are also various models and tools available. For example, there is a concept known as growth levers. Here, you simply analyze what factors could allow your business to grow and expand. Typically, there are 6 major growth levers, one of which is market penetration. Another option is encouraging customers to use your product or service more frequently. You might also work on premiumization, upgrading your product offering to a higher value version. For instance, Apple does this when it offers the standard iPhone alongside premium versions such as iPhone Pro or iPhone Pro Max. So there are many different levers you can pull, and it is crucial to clearly understand which ones you can rely on. Once you have answered the 3 key questions, where to play, why there, and how you will win, you can move on to developing a more detailed strategy.
There is indeed a widely discussed view among academics and business leaders that strategic planning, particularly the type that became very popular in the 1970s, no longer makes sense in today's world, in a Bani or VUCA environment, as they say. The argument is that companies should move toward other forms of strategic thinking, because a rigid strategic plan that is developed once and then followed step by step quickly loses relevance. Instead, it must constantly be reviewed, and organizations need to work with scenarios, for example, or define triggers that would shift the company from one course of action to another. What do you think about that?
I understand where these concerns come from, and indeed, even in companies that actively practice strategic planning, many things have changed. First of all, planning horizons have become shorter. In the past, companies sometimes developed strategies for decades ahead. Today, no one really plans that far into the future. But on the other hand, it seems wrong to completely abandon the process. Think about it this way. Calculators were invented, then computers appeared, and now we have even more powerful computers. But that does not mean the multiplication table has stopped being relevant. I often use this metaphor. Imagine you are the captain of a ship sailing across the sea. Several centuries ago, when explorers were discovering new lands and continents like America, their set of tools was extremely limited. What did they have? They had a compass. They also had a sextant, which allowed them to measure the height of the stars or the sun above the horizon. And when, for example, they sailed into a storm, they could not see the shore and had no visual sense of where they were. They could not see the stars either because the sky was covered with clouds. So they were left with only 2 things. First, they knew where they had set out from and where they were supposed to arrive. Second, they had a compass that helped them maintain their direction. Today, everything has changed. We now have satellite navigation and many other instruments. But even now, you still need to understand where you are and where you want to get to. And you must realize that there is a journey ahead of you. That journey is strategy. It is the path to your destination. Even if some tools appear or disappear along the way, this overall understanding must still remain. And that is exactly what strategic planning helps provide.
But look, when a ship is caught in a storm, it primarily reacts to immediate challenges. If a wave comes, the ship must turn its bow toward it rather than expose its side, and so on. In other words, it reacts to threats, and its final destination becomes somewhat secondary. At that moment, the priority is survival. I'm not sure whether we can directly compare the current situation in Ukraine to such a storm, but even if we are in a storm and simply trying to survive, sooner or later the storm will pass. And if we still have the opportunity to move forward, even gradually, tacking from side to side like a sailing vessel, we are still moving toward a certain destination. If you have no strategy or strategic planning, you simply react, you just drift like you mentioned earlier with Alice from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. You will eventually arrive somewhere. If that is acceptable to you, then perhaps strategy is not necessary.
In that case, the goal of survival may be achieved, but getting closer to a strategic objective will largely
Depend on chance. It might coincide, but
it might work out or it might not.
it will depend on where the currents carry you, on which shore you end up. I would add that this is an interesting point. An uncertain environment often pushes organizations to focus more on tactical planning and on responding to daily or weekly challenges. In this case, strategy is still necessary because we want to plan ahead. In other words, we seek some degree of long-term certainty, even though it constantly changes. Through these tactical adjustments, we might find ourselves every quarter or every 6 months realizing that the strategy needs to be updated. And it seems to me that this process of updating the strategy is extremely important. In other words, it is not so much about the exact strategy we develop for the next 6 months or even the next few years, but about the preparation that leads up to the strategy process itself. At this stage, we need to gather analytics, take a deeper look at ourselves as an organization, hold internal discussions and brainstorming sessions within the team, analyze the market, possibly talk to competitors, consult with external advisors, and so on. In short, we need to understand ourselves better, and this is also important for tactical decision-making. We do it in order to shape strategy and see further ahead. But how we deal with everyday challenges is also largely determined by this preparatory stage of strategy work. In other words, preparation can sometimes be more important than the final result.
Still, there is a risk that we end up moving like a bee, constantly adjusting the strategy first in one direction, then in another. Yes, we would still be moving somewhere in the end, but there might be too many unnecessary movements along the way.
Well, I don't know. Bees are actually quite efficient as far as I know.
Colleagues, this reminds me of another remark by Henry Mintzberg, whom I already mentioned earlier today. At one point, he said that strategy is not about predicting the future. Strategic thinking is about preparing for the unknown. And in my view, that is extremely important.
Who can and should initiate the request to develop a strategy? Why do I ask? Because, for example, there are companies where the business is essentially a hobby for the owner. They simply enjoy doing what they do. In such cases, there may be no real demand for strategy. But should the request come only from the owner? Or could it also come from the bottom up, for example, from within the organization? And in your opinion, what might motivate an owner to develop this demand for strategy in the first place?
I believe that the demand for strategy should emerge simultaneously from two directions. First, of course, from the owner or owners, because a company may have multiple shareholders. Even if there are thousands of them, they are still the ones who own the business. And they should want a strategy because it provides an understanding of where the business is heading. But besides the owner's request, I also believe that such a request should come from the people who directly manage the company. For example, the board of directors. Why? Because now we are touching on a slightly different topic. If we look at what generally determines a person's effectiveness and performance, it depends on three components. First, a person, or in our case, an organization, must be competent in what they do. Second, the person or organization must be motivated. And third, and this element is very often forgotten, a person or organization must clearly understand what is expected of them. From this perspective, the board of directors can, and in my view should, say to the owners, please formulate a strategic objective for the next 3 to 5 years. What exactly do you expect from us so that we can align our actions with that goal, develop plans, and operate effectively? Because if we do not understand the owner's expectations, we simply do not know what we are supposed to do.
I would also like to comment on the situation where the owner cannot clearly define a goal or believes that having one is unnecessary. Presumably, a competent and effective board can propose to the owner different options for strategic objectives with various plans for achieving them. They can outline how to reach these objectives, including the resources required and the associated risks. In this way, the owner can make an informed choice.
I fully agree with that. The only point I'd add is that if the initiative to define strategic objectives comes from the board, those objectives must always be aligned with the owner.
At what stages does it make sense to involve the team and managers so they understand the direction we're heading and can take ownership of the strategy? In other words, at which points should different people be engaged?
I want to clarify this question a bit because team involvement is often seen more as a kind of manipulative tool. For example, to get the team to accept an action plan, endorse the strategy, or adopt the strategic objectives. In that case, it's a form of manipulation and not really part of developing the strategy. So the question is, to what extent does it make sense to involve the team during strategy development? And the purpose of their involvement could be either to help them feel ownership of the strategy or genuinely to gather insights that will be useful for shaping the strategy itself.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. If we look at how business has evolved globally, about 30, 40 years ago, even major companies commonly believed that they could hire an external consultant and the consultant would develop the strategy for them. This is a mistaken notion, and I'm glad to see that it is becoming less common today. Why is it mistaken? Let me explain. Returning to the definition of strategy, it's the planning of actions that will distinguish you from your competitors and actions that will bring you closer to your objectives. The point is, if you are a commercial organization aiming to develop a strategy, no one knows your strengths and weaknesses better than you do. And no one understands the specific nuances of your business better than you. No one understands the potential behavior of your friends or competitors better than you. That's one point. Second, if an external party comes in to develop a strategy for you, very often what happens is that there is no sense of ownership of that strategy. In English, this is called ownership. A consultant develops some strategy for you, and if something goes wrong, the consultant is blamed. You say, we had nothing to do with it. But then the question arises, why do you need consultants at all? Consultants have unique knowledge and skills related to organizing the process. A consultant can help you structure the strategic planning process because they know the steps involved and the nuances at each stage. Consultants can pose to you a lot of very important and interesting questions you may not have thought about. By answering these questions, you can examine yourself, your organization, and your strategy from different perspectives. The consultant's task is precisely to set up the strategic planning process to ensure conditions that allow you to view your business, your opportunities, and your risks from multiple angles. This, in turn, helps you create a flexible and effective strategy. So the answer to your question is that the team should indeed be involved, but the key questions are when and to what extent. For example, when creating the first top-line strategy, the step where you answer the first 3 fundamental questions, the outcome should be a set of clearly defined strategic objectives. At this stage, only a limited group of people should be involved. I would say the owner, the CEO, and possibly the board. That's it. These people set the strategic direction as the organization develops further. Once the strategic objectives are defined, the process of strategic planning begins, which we haven't discussed in detail yet. At this stage, you need to involve a broader group of people. For a deep analysis, you'll need people from marketing, sales, and of course production if it exists in your organization. These people can provide insight into key trends and realities in their respective areas. HR, the function responsible for people, can also play a very important role in this process. So, as you move into strategic planning, the circle of participants and organizational functions expands.
A strategic session is not the same as strategy development. It can be a part of it. Engaging and involving the broader team within the company can also be a significant part of the strategic process. On the other hand, the same applies to the strategy itself. We've discussed that the action plan is one part of the strategy, but there are other components. Andriy, help us fill in the missing parts of this picture, please.
Thank you for the question. We discussed the first stage, the top-line strategy, where to play, why there, and how to win. After defining strategic objectives, the strategic planning process begins, starting with a deep analysis of multiple aspects. The organization must analyze its past actions, the competitive environment, and the broader business environment, and identify benchmarks or role models. This includes benchmarking, learning from others who do something well. The result of this analysis is the identification of opportunities and risks. This is exactly the SWOT analysis we discussed earlier. Once opportunities and risks are identified, we can start generating potential actions. First, we generate a wide range of possible actions. These are the strategic initiatives. The next step is to analyze and prioritize them, because not all initiatives are equally effective and each requires different levels of resources. So we analyze all the generated strategic initiatives and select those the company should focus on. There can't be too many, usually 2 or 3, and they should be spread over time. Some short-term, some mid-term, some long-term. Then all of this needs to be translated into a very detailed operational plan. That plan answers the question, what exactly do we need to do to implement each initiative? There are many nuances here. The most challenging part is defining performance indicators, KPIs, correctly because there are different types. Usually people tend to define only the final KPIs, but leading indicators are often missing. Those are the metrics that guide you along the way and show whether you are moving in the right direction. Once the operational plans are developed, they must be executed. It's crucial to continuously monitor progress, compare interim results to the goals, analyze effectiveness, and make corrective actions if needed. So yes, it's a truly complex process.
Your practical experience is very interesting. You see many companies and requests. You participate at different stages of strategy development, and your experience in practical implementation is particularly valuable.
For example, I conducted a strategic session for a Ukrainian company, an agricultural holding, not the largest but quite well known in Ukraine. This was done before the full-scale invasion, and the company was eager to understand where to move next. They had a combination of products, sugar beet, sugar production, soybean cultivation, and other grains for export. So what did we do? First, we performed an environmental analysis. The company owners had already set financial objectives, how much profit the business should generate in the long term, etc. And we analyzed how to achieve those targets. We studied the business environment, what was happening around them. We used a technique called PESTLE analysis, political, economic, social, cultural, technological, environmental, and legal factors that could impact the business. Based on this work, you can make assumptions or projections about what the business environment might look like over the next 3 to 5 years. From there, you can draw conclusions about opportunities and risks. This is exactly what we were doing. So how did we approach it? First, we met with the company's CEO and discussed his expectations for the strategic session, what he wanted to achieve as a result. Then, my colleagues and I planned how the session would be structured. We proposed the tools and techniques we would use and created a sort of homework assignment for the company. They were expected to perform the initial analysis on their own and come to the session with the results already prepared. I provided them with a briefing explaining exactly what needed to be done, why this analysis was needed, how to conduct it technically, and what the physical outputs of the analysis should look like. We even provided templates and guidance on how to fill them out correctly. The CEO distributed these tasks among the board members and top management team. Each person was assigned a specific area for research. During the process, they would share preliminary results with us. I would review them, provide feedback and comments, and they would refine their work accordingly. Then they came to the strategic session already prepared with the analysis results. Each participant presented their area of analysis to the group. Together, we reviewed everything and decided what opportunities for business development do we see. We conducted brainstorming sessions with the team to agree on the opportunities and risks that were relevant and significant for the business. This is not as simple as it seems, because different people perceive things differently. Once opportunities and risks were identified, we brainstormed strategic initiatives, actions to leverage opportunities and counter risks. Finally, we analyzed and prioritized these strategic initiatives, deciding what the company should focus on first, second, and so on. That's how we worked, and those initiatives gradually started being implemented. Unfortunately, the full-scale invasion then began.
Andriy, is PESTLE analysis commonly used in Ukrainian business? When it comes to strategy, standard tools like SWOT or Porter's 5 forces are widely used. However, PESTLE, honestly, in my entire career, I have encountered perhaps 1 or 2 cases where it was actually applied for strategic planning. How can it be useful in developing a strategy?
Thank you for that question. I genuinely like this tool. Let's start with what it actually stands for. On the basis of this analysis, you can then build a high-quality SWOT, because you take the insights generated through the PESTLE analysis and translate them into opportunities, as well as external risks and threats. That's the first point. Secondly, why do I like it? Because businesses, especially small international companies or local firms, often make a common mistake when they focus only on the areas they understand well, the areas familiar to them, and year after year repeat essentially the same type of analysis. So, for example, we look at what our competitors are doing. Even there, the issue is more complex because there is direct competition, but there can also be indirect competition. And how do you identify companies that operate outside your core business sector, yet still compete with you? That's a critical question. Companies may monitor legislative changes, for instance, and of course, that is taken into account. But PESTLE analysis enables you to look at the business environment through multiple lenses. Take socio-cultural factors as an example. How many companies truly analyze what is happening to the population in their country? How is the demographic structure changing? Is the population getting younger or aging? Are people migrating, for example, from rural areas to cities? If it does exist, then in what volumes? How is business currently being affected by the fact that so many people are abroad? Do they plan to return or not? All of these questions are critical because they affect demand and determine what kind of workforce will be available in the coming years. And all of that represents fundamental strategic considerations for any business.
Clearly, such analysis is useful for large corporations operating on a national scale. But how relevant is it for mid-sized businesses?
For example, a company operating within just 1, 2, or 3 regions of Ukraine, even then, it is still essential to understand what is happening in that specific market and how broader market trends will affect the particular region where you operate. Actually, this reminds me of another example that might be interesting for you. It could be quite illustrative. When the full-scale invasion began, we were approached by Swiss Contact, an international organization funded by the Swiss government. In Ukraine, they run a number of projects, including initiatives focused on developing the vocational education and training system. So this was not a business case per se. What happened was that when the full-scale invasion started, many vocational institutions were first of all relocated to other regions, and secondly, as you can imagine, funding became a serious issue, since the state had to prioritize defense spending. Fortunately, Ukrainian legislation allows such educational institutions to seek additional sources of funding independently. So, Swiss Contact approached us to train these vocational institutions in strategic planning. They were facing the question of how to build their strategy and how to identify and secure alternative funding sources. Of course, we agreed to support them as this was not a commercial engagement. We provided the information in a very concise and simplified format. Nevertheless, we explained what strategy is, what strategic planning entails, and what the overall process looks like. They even had to develop a concrete plan for the following year, outlining specific strategic initiatives they intended to implement. So why am I sharing this story? When we worked through the PESTLE analysis with them and they genuinely conducted it, the conclusions they reached were quite insightful. For example, one vocational institution had been relocated from Donetsk region to Chernivtsi. They said, "We realize that here, in this new environment, we need to rethink our entire approach. We have to reconsider how we attract prospective students. We must rethink our communication and engagement with the local community, because no one here knows us. We are a newly relocated institution, and we need to introduce ourselves, explain who we are, what we offer, and which professions we can train people for, especially professions that may not have previously been taught in this region." That was particularly interesting. The feedback we received from participants was very strong. They told us that the PESTLE analysis truly helped them see their new environment from a different perspective, and that it was extremely useful.
Andriy, thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you very much. This has been a very engaging, insightful, and valuable conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andriy.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you soon on our channel.